Hi, it's Lorna, and today I'm going to show you how to make a stencil. So stencil making is really useful for a lot of different mediums. You can use them with acrylic, you can use them with markers, and for my purpose, is the reason why I'm making them is because I wanted to use them with my art crayons, because there's a really cool technique that I'll show you in another video that you can use with them. So I have here a cutting mat. And a cutting mat is really important so that you don't cut holes into your table. If you don't have one of these, a piece of cardboard, maybe a bunch of pieces of cardboard, depending on how heavy-handed you are, or just a regular kitchen cutting board would work. But I don't know if you want to use your food items for crafting. So speaking of crafting, I have a craft knife, also known as a hobby knife. Some people call them X-Acto knives. This is an X-Acto brand, and I've talked about this in other videos, but it's one of my favorite X-Acto blades, or my favorite craft knives. So you just want to make sure that you're using a sharp blade. So I have here a few different tools. I have the Sharpie marker. You want to use kind of a permanent marker for this, otherwise it's going to kind of wear off. But if you don't want it to show, you're welcome to use a washable marker. It just might rub off while you're cutting. I don't mind that the lines show, so I go ahead and use a permanent marker. I'd rather use a permanent marker than have it transfer onto me. But if you want a nice clean stencil when you're done, go ahead and use washable markers. It should work on this plastic, no problem. So these stencils, you really just want to make sure that when you're lining up your pattern that it doesn't go all the way through, and I'll talk more on that in a minute. But I'm using the transparent Yupo paper, and they have it in a bunch of different varieties and thicknesses. I don't know if I'm saying it right. It's Yupo, Y-U-P-O, and it's really great because it's a thin plastic. Now if you think of a lot of stencils, they're more of on the harder side, a hard plastic. That's because they last a lot longer, honestly. And they have machines that laser cut them or die cut them, or little blades that just cut them for them. So when I'm using it for my own stencils, I want something that's light enough to where my blade will go through, but I also like the transparent because I can line it up with my project. So I'll show you on here. If I put the clear transparent paper over top of this, you can, one, trace a picture if you wanted, and two, you can make sure that it's lined up in your project. So if I wanted to put it in between the lines here, so in between like Yupo and this red part down here, I could line it up so that my stencil goes in between. And that's a really fun thing to be able to do, especially when you can't, if you couldn't see underneath, you might not have your stencil in the right place. You can also make what's called a register, and that's, I'll explain that in a little bit. Okay, so those are the materials that you're going to need. You could use something for a stencil that is not the Yupo paper. They have lots of different stenciling plastics that you can purchase. Yupo paper is just my favorite for making stencils. So I'm going to draw a quick leaf design with you. There's no correct side. I just got a little bit of oil pastels from another project on there, so I flipped it. So I want to start by making just a line in the center of my page. These are just scraps of paper that I'm working on today. You're welcome to make a full-size stencil or many stencils on the same page. Like oftentimes you see in the store, you'll have a set of stencils. Usually when I get them that way, I cut them apart because I don't typically like the placement that they have, and I don't like that they get in the way. So usually I'll cut those kinds of stencils apart. So you just want to make sure that you have about 1 millimeter space in between all of your pieces. And you want to do that because otherwise your stencil will be really fragile, and when you go over it with anything like a paintbrush or a crayon or anything like that, your stencil will buckle or even tear. So you want to make sure that you're leaving enough plastic in between so that isn't too fragile. If you're making a one-time use stencil, you're welcome to use paper or cardstock or cardboard, and you're welcome to put your lines as close together as you want without cutting through, because with a one-time stencil, if it kind of tears while you're working with it, it's not as big a deal. But if you want something that will last over the course of at least one whole project, you want to use something a little bit sturdier and make sure that your lines are about 1 millimeter apart. So I'm going to show you this tree example. As far as the lines, usually I would make my lines go all the way up, but that would cut my paper right in half. So you want to make sure you have these little breaks in between. Sometimes you see lettering that has breaks in between, and that's for the same reason, is that if it was all the way through, it would just fall apart. If for some reason you cut through in a place that you didn't want to cut through, sometimes you can fix it by putting some Scotch tape over the entire area and then cutting out a window in the Scotch tape where you want your hole to be, which kind of reinforces the area. There is some ways that you can fix it, but just try and be really careful. So while I'm drawing this, I'm really making sure that my pieces aren't touching. I am trying to make sure that they're all 1 millimeter apart, give or take. And I'm thinking about my skill level and my ability to cut. So I don't want to draw something that is so complex that I won't be able to cut it out. And I also want to make sure that it looks nice. So if you're just starting out, make sure that you're doing something that is pretty simple. And then work your way into doing something a little bit more complicated. I would say that this leaf pattern is a very good beginning pattern, and then the flower that I have there is intermediate. I would say that the wood pattern is also intermediate pattern. When you're comfortable, maybe move on to something like that. And then if you're feeling really confident, you can go as far as cutting out maybe a tiger or something like that. Would be quite challenging. Or maybe a robot with all its little holes and parts and gears could be quite fun. So I talked a little bit earlier in the video about a register. And a register just means that you're putting a mark on your paper that's going to line up with a mark on another paper, so another stencil. And you'll see in a lot of store-bought stencils that they do have registers in them. Sometimes they're holes that you cut out with a hole punch, and sometimes they're little marks. So you could use a hole punch, cut yours out, and do that so that they line up. But you could just draw it on because this is transparent plastic. But if it wasn't transparent, you'd want to put a hole in it. So they just line up so that when you're hanging them on the wall and you're doing some sort of stencil that's grand or big, or you want to repeat the stencil over and over and over again, you want to make sure that you're using a register so that it lines up correctly. So if you just line up those two little marks, you'll know that the stencil is in the correct place every time. Usually they have multiple registers. Just having one in the corner won't be that successful, unless you just want to know the general placement. So when I cut with the X-Acto blade, I like to cut from left to right. I like to pull towards me. You should do whatever is comfortable for you. If you're comfortable pulling away from you, you should do that. Cutting plastic is a little bit different than cutting paper. Both of them you need a sharp X-Acto blade for. However, with plastic, you just want to make sure that it's not pulling. So when I say when it's not pulling, you want to make sure that your blade is cutting through smoothly. If it's starting to be really tough to pull through, you may not be pushing hard enough, or you may be pushing too hard. Depending on the thickness of your plastic, it's a little bit different because it feels like you're cutting directly into your cutting mat. Versus paper, you can tell the difference in feel. You'd really have to cut a lot of paper and a lot of plastic to notice the difference, I think. But I noticed that it is a little bit more difficult to cut the plastic. So these little almond shapes here, I'm just going to make sure that they are far enough away from the center line so that they don't connect. And then I also want to make sure they're far enough away from each other. I tend not to trace exactly when I'm cutting out with the X-Acto blade, especially if I'm doing a quick tutorial like this. So I'm just going to follow along mostly with my lines and just do what's comfortable for my wrist and what's comfortable for my blade. Sometimes when we draw with a pen or a pencil, it's easier than it is to do with a blade because your blade doesn't turn and curve in the same way that a pen or pencil will in your hands. Can you cut out everything that you could draw? Yes, but it will take a significantly longer amount of time, and you'll need to rotate your paper more often to fit those little wiggles and curves that your hand makes. So I'm just going to follow with my blade and what's comfortable with my blade and not my line art here. But I'm going to use my line art as a guide. So I'm just going to go ahead and time lapse me cutting out the rest of this. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. It really helps us out. If we get to 100 subscribers, we can get a custom YouTube name. So that would be really helpful if you would subscribe. If you also want to be notified of when we post new videos, hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching. Bye.